Peace hung over the Brooks family's kitchen like a fragile thread. Then a sound broke at a single bark that carried more urgency than fear, more truth than words ever could. Before the morning was over, that bark would reveal something hidden in plain sight, something that turned a loyal pet into a legend. Tap like and subscribe for more true stories of courage and heart, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Elijah Brooks had always started his mornings early, long before the sun rose over the pine trees that lined his small Carolina town. As a black widower, raising his only son alone each morning carried both weight and gratitude, the ache of loss and the duty of love. The house was quiet except for the ticking wall clock and the low hum of gospel music floating from the radio. His kitchen was simple, modest, and full of memory. The white curtains his late wife had sewn still hung over the window, their edges yellowed slightly by the years. Her touch lingered in small ways, a chipped mug she'd called his lucky cup, a recipe card in her handwriting now stained with coffee rings. Elijah stirred the oatmeal, slowly watching it bubble, the scent of cinnamon and oats filling the air. Behind him, Duke, his German shepherd, his shadow, his protector, stretched on the floor near the stove. Duke's coat glistened in the light of dawn, thick and golden along the spine. He was no ordinary dog. Elijah swore there was something almost human in those amber eyes, as if the animal carried a piece of understanding the world had forgotten. Caleb, his 1-year-old son, gurgled in the high chair, slapping the tray with tiny palms, sending small ripples of oatmeal onto his bib. The nanny, Miss Laureen, smiled as she fed him spoonfuls, her soft southern accent humming warmth into the kitchen. "You've got a strong appetite, baby," she cooed. Elijah poured 2 mugs of coffee, sliding one toward her. "You've been a godsend, Laureen," he said quietly. She waved a hand, her smile tired but kind. "Just doing what I can. You've been through enough, Elijah." Her eyes softened, and for a second he looked away, the kind of look that hides pain under politeness. He didn't talk about his wife anymore. Some grief wasn't meant to be shared. It was meant to be carried. Outside, a light fog still clung to the trees. The world was waking gently without urgency. Elijah leaned against the counter, watching Caleb's eyes dance with innocent joy, the baby babbling to no one in particular. Duke yawned, tail thumping lazily against the tile. It was one of those rare mornings where everything felt right, the kind of calm a man learns not to trust because he knows peace has a habit of breaking without warning. The radio faded to silence, replaced by the soft whistle of the kettle. Laureen laughed as Caleb tried to grab the spoon again, oatmeal smearing across his cheek. "He's got your stubbornness," she said. Elijah chuckled. "Yeah, but I hope he gets his mama's heart." Then a sound, subtle, a shift in the air. Duke's ears twitched. He froze mid-motion. Eyes locked forward, nostrils flaring slightly. Elijah noticed it only because the dog's tail stopped wagging. "What is it, boy?" he asked, his tone calm but curious. Duke didn't blink. His gaze cut straight to the high chair. His muscles tensed, and a low vibration began to rise in his chest, the kind of growl that didn't come from fear or anger, but instinct. Laureen turned, startled. "He's just jealous," she teased nervously, holding the spoon in midair. But the spoon didn't move, neither did Duke. The German shepherd's head tilted slightly, and his nose wrinkled. Elijah's stomach tightened. He'd seen Duke react to strangers before, to sudden noises, even to thunder, but never like this. There was no bark, no pacing, just a stillness that pressed down on the room. Then, like a match striking, Duke let out one sharp bark. Caleb jumped and began to cry. The spoon clattered to the floor, oatmeal splattering across the linoleum. Duke Elijah barked, his voice deeper, commanding the tone of a man who'd been military once and never forgot it. But Duke didn't back down. He stood tall, tail-straight eyes, never leaving the bowl. Laureen looked at Elijah, panic flashing in her face. "He almost bit me," she cried. Elijah stepped between them, grabbing Duke's collar, but something stopped him. a faint scent he hadn't noticed before. It was quick, almost ghost-like, but sharp. Chemical. He frowned, scanning the air, his heart skipping once. He had cleaned the kitchen last night. The bottle of cleaner was under the sink, sealed. Wasn't it? Duke's growl deepened his eyes, burning now with something fierce and certain. Elijah's grip loosened on the collar. Duke took one step forward, nose-twitching gaze fixed on Caleb's tray. Elijah felt the chill crawl up his spine. He didn't know why yet, but he trusted the dog's instincts more than his own eyes. "Lorene," he said quietly, his voice steady but urgent, "put the spoon down." She hesitated, confused the baby, still whimpering softly. Duke growled again, a sound that rolled through the small kitchen like thunder building in the distance. The cry came before Elijah could even reach the table. One moment, Lorene was laughing softly at Caleb's messy face, and the next, Duke lunged forward with a snarl that tore through the calm like thunder, splitting open a quiet sky. The chair scraped violently across the tile. The spoon clattered, and oatmeal splashed against the counter. Caleb wailed, his tiny hands trembling as the bowl rattled in front of him. "Duke, no." Elijah's voice boomed through the kitchen, deep and commanding, a voice that once made men halt mid-step. But Duke didn't stop. His paws skidded claws, scraping muscles, rippling like coiled steel. His eyes, burning gold, weren't on Lorene's face, but on the spoon in her trembling hand. Lorene stumbled back against the sink, her voice breaking. "He's gone mad. Elijah, he's attacking me." Duke's teeth flashed, and for one horrifying heartbeat, his jaws snapped just inches from her arm, close enough for her to feel the rush of air. She screamed, shielding her face, but Duke didn't press forward. He barked again, sharp-clipped, desperate. Elijah grabbed his collar with both hands, straining to pull him back, but Duke fought against him, not in rage, but in refusal, as if something far greater than obedience was at stake. Caleb's cries filled the house, shrill, and terrified his small body trembling in the high chair. "It's okay, baby. It's okay," Elijah shouted over the chaos, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The air was wrong. The smell was wrong. Everything was wrong. Lorene, her chest heaving, dropped the spoon to the floor. Duke's gaze followed it down, his tail rigid, and when it clattered, he barked once more, low and guttural. Elijah dragged him back, pushing him toward the corner. "Down, Duke, down," he commanded. The German shepherd froze, chest-heaving, breath ragged. For a few seconds, no one moved. The entire house seemed to hold its breath. Lorene's hands shook violently as she backed away from the table. "He could have torn my arm off," she cried. Elijah's heart thundered in his chest. He looked at Duke, who now stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on the high chair. There was no fury left in them, only a terrible kind of certainty. Elijah turned slowly toward the table. Caleb's bowl had tipped sideways, oatmeal dripping down the tray. Something dark speckled the pale mush, tiny black flecks so faint they could have been mistaken for cinnamon. But they weren't. He knew that smell, now faint but unmistakable. Cleaner. His stomach twisted. Lorene followed his gaze, her voice trembling. "Elijah, what is that?" He didn't answer. Duke whined softly, head-lowering eyes darting between father and son. He'd seen that look before in Iraq when a dog at the base had warned soldiers of something buried beneath the sand. He hadn't believed it then until the ground exploded. Now that same sound filled his kitchen. Elijah crouched beside the bowl, breathing shallowly, careful not to touch it. The scent burned faintly in his throat, sharp and metallic. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the memory of loss, the fear of reliving it. "Don't move," he whispered to Lorene, his voice barely audible. "Don't touch anything." She blinked, confused tears streaking down her cheeks. "It's just oatmeal," she whispered. He was feeding him oatmeal. Elijah shook his head slowly, eyes never leaving the bowl. "No, not just that." He turned toward Duke, who stood as if carved from stone, ears tilted forward. "You smelled it, didn't you, boy?" The dog gave a small, throaty sound, half whine, half confirmation. Elijah's breath hitched. Lorene pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "Are you saying there's poison?" She whispered the word, catching like a thorn. Elijah didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was in the dog's eyes, in the sharp bark that had stopped her spoon mid-air, in the unseen instinct that had saved his son from something no human could sense. The radio crackled softly in the background, the gospel song now replaced by static. Outside, a lawnmower hummed faintly somewhere down the street, life continuing unaware of the storm gathering in this one kitchen. Elijah stood pulling his phone from his pocket with shaking hands. "I'm calling emergency services," he said. "Don't feed him another bite. Don't even breathe near that bowl." Lorene nodded, her whole body trembling as she stepped back. Caleb whimpered softly, reaching toward his father. Elijah pressed a kiss to the boy's forehead, his voice breaking. "It's okay, son. Daddy's got you." Duke circled once and sat directly between the baby and the bowl, his broad chest rising and falling like a sentinel guarding a gate. His ears twitched toward every sound, but his eyes stayed locked on the source of danger, the meal that had nearly taken a life. Elijah could still smell it, faint and vile, mixed with the sweetness of oats and milk. The house was no longer quiet. Caleb's cries echoed through the kitchen, a sound that tore at Elijah's chest, while Duke stood like a sentinel, unmoving, his breath heavy and hot against the tile. The air carried the strange, bitter tang of something unnatural clinging to the back of Elijah's throat, even as he knelt beside the high chair. Lorene was shaking her apron, stained one hand pressed to her chest. "He nearly bit me," she whispered, voice trembling with confusion and fear. Elijah didn't answer. His mind was running too fast, but every thought came back to one point: the smell. It wasn't food, and it wasn't just cleaner. It was something harsh, almost metallic, buried beneath the sweetness of oats. He picked up the spoon from the floor, carefully turning it over in his hand. A smear of oatmeal clung to the metal, speckled with tiny black dots. Duke growled again, low and warning, his tail stiff as a board. Elijah brought the spoon close to his nose and inhaled, then flinched. It burned faintly sharp enough to sting. That was all the confirmation he needed. He turned to Lorene, who stood frozen near the counter. "Don't come closer," he said firmly. "Don't touch that bowl. Don't touch anything on that tray." She blinked at him, her eyes wide. "Elijah, what are you saying?" "You think I'm not thinking," he interrupted, voice rising before he forced it down. "I'm seeing. There's something in that food." His heart pounded so hard it hurt. Duke moved a step forward, planting himself squarely between Caleb and the bowl, his nose twitching, but his body held in tight control. The baby hiccuped through his tears, unaware that danger had brushed this close. Elijah grabbed a dish towel and draped it over the bowl like a soldier covering a fallen comrade. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice stayed steady. "We're calling the police," he said again, though he had already done it minutes before. Lorene nodded mutely, tears pooling in her eyes. "Elijah, I swear I didn't." "I know," he said softly, not looking at her. "I know you didn't." Because the way Duke stood now, rigid, but not hostile, alert, but not afraid, told him this wasn't about people. It was about something unseen, something that had slipped quietly into their lives without permission. He looked around the kitchen, scanning every surface, every bottle, every open container. His gaze stopped on the pantry door. A sliver of light cut through the small crack between the hinges. Duke's ears flicked that way too, like he was confirming Elijah's suspicion. The floor creaked as Elijah crossed the room, his boots heavy, his breath shallow. He pushed the pantry door open slowly. Inside, the faint smell grew stronger. Bottles lined the shelf, vinegar, oils, cleaners, detergents, all stored together because space was limited. His wife had told him not to keep them there once, and now that memory came back like a whisper in his ear. "You mix food and chemicals, one day something's gonna go wrong, Eli." He closed his eyes briefly, the guilt twisting deep. He spotted the cleaner bottle sitting sideways, its cap not fully closed, a thin trail of dried liquid running down the side. On the shelf below, it sat the baby oatmeal container lid, off from earlier that morning. A few drops barely visible had dried across the rim. His breath hitched. He didn't have to be a scientist to see the picture forming. "God," he whispered, gripping the edge of the shelf. Duke barked sharply behind him, drawing his attention back. He turned to see Lorene holding Caleb, trying to calm him. The baby had stopped crying, his head resting against her shoulder, but his small face was still flushed red. "It's all right," she said softly, her hands trembling. "He's safe now." Elijah nodded, though his heart still raced. He grabbed a plastic bag from the drawer and sealed the spoon and a bit of the oatmeal inside his mind, already anticipating the questions, the disbelief, the weight of proof. Duke followed his movements closely, tail slowly relaxing, but eyes still alert. Elijah crouched and placed a hand on his fur. "You knew," he said under his breath. Duke leaned into the touch slightly, then looked toward the high chair again, as if to remind him the danger wasn't gone, it was just paused. Elijah felt the tremor of gratitude ripple through him, followed immediately by guilt. If Duke hadn't been there, if he'd been running late, if he'd dismissed that growl as nonsense, Caleb wouldn't be breathing right now. He straightened and looked back at Lorene. "We need to open the windows," he said. "Let this air out." She nodded, moving quickly, her hands still unsteady as she unlatched the panes. A cool gust rushed in, carrying away some of the sharpness in the air. The siren sounded faint in the distance, now growing louder. Elijah exhaled shakily, feeling the weight of what just happened settle on his shoulders. He turned to Duke again. "Good boy," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. Duke gave a quiet grunt, as if to say it wasn't over yet. Elijah knelt beside the high chair one more time, looking at the covered bowl. The towel's edge was stained with tiny dark spots. He lifted one corner cautiously and studied the surface of the oatmeal beneath. The black flecks shimmered faintly, unnatural. They weren't food. They weren't anything that belonged in a kitchen. His throat tightened as he remembered the faint burn from the spoon. It wasn't just cleaner, it was poison. He pulled the towel back over it, pressing his palm against the fabric like he was sealing a grave. The siren stopped outside. Red and blue lights danced across the kitchen walls, glinting off the metal surfaces. He heard the doors slam, the muffled rush of footsteps. For a second, the relief made his knees weak. Duke barked once short and sharp, signaling their arrival. Elijah whispered to himself, "We made it in time." The words felt like prayer. He looked down at his son sleeping now in Lorene's trembling arms, unaware of how close the morning had come to ending forever. He would never know the sound Duke made just before lunging, never know that his life had hung in the balance between instinct and disbelief. Elijah swallowed, hard eyes glistening as he glanced at Duke again. Elijah's hands were still shaking as the officers stepped into the house, their radios crackling, the metallic scent of danger still thick in the air. Duke stayed by the high chair posture, tense but silent, his amber eyes locked on the bowl beneath the towel. Caleb stirred softly in Lorene's arms, unaware that the thin line between life and loss had already been crossed and pulled back. The officers began to ask questions: what happened when it started, who was present, but Elijah barely heard them. His mind was somewhere else, retracing the morning in flashes, every sound, every scent, every movement replaying with brutal clarity. Duke had been pacing near the pantry before breakfast, nose-twitching paws tapping on the tile, restless in a way that should have meant something. He'd thought it was boredom, the dog wanting to go outside, but now he saw it differently. Duke hadn't been pacing in distraction. He'd been warning them long before the first bark. That realization hit harder than the panic itself. Elijah leaned against the counter, his breathing uneven. The officer nearest him, a tall woman with a stern face softened by concern, asked quietly, "Sir, you said—" The dog lunged before anyone ate the food. Elijah nodded slowly. "Yeah, he didn't just bark. He attacked the spoon, like he knew." His voice cracked on that last word. The woman exchanged a glance with her partner, who was already kneeling near the high chair, lifting the towel carefully with gloved hands. "It smells like ammonia," the man muttered. "Industrial grade. We'll get a field test on it." Duke gave a low rumble at the movement, not hostile, just warning. Elijah placed a calming hand on his fur. "Easy boy," he whispered. "They're here to help." But the truth was, Duke didn't trust anyone near that bowl, not yet. Not until the danger was fully removed. Lorene stood frozen by the sink, rocking Caleb gently. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. "I swear I didn't." Elijah turned sharply. "I know you didn't," he said again, softer this time. "This wasn't you." He looked towards the pantry, the shelves now bright under the overhead light bottles and containers lined neatly but ominously. Something leaked. "That cleaner." His voice wavered. "I think Duke smelled it long before I did." The officer opened her kit, dipping a test strip into a small sample of the oatmeal. Within seconds, the color shifted from pale yellow to deep green. "Confirmed," she said flatly. "That's poison. Common household cleaner, but concentrated. You're lucky the child didn't eat." Elijah pressed a hand to his face, feeling the sting of cold sweat against his palm. The room swam slightly. Lucky, the word felt hollow. Luck hadn't saved them, instinct had. Love had. He looked down at Duke, who still hadn't moved an inch from his guard position. The officer beside him, young and skeptical, asked, "How'd the dog know?" Elijah exhaled slowly. "He's family," he said. "He doesn't need to know. He just feels it." Outside, another siren faded into silence. Neighbors began to gather beyond the porch, faces pressed to the windows, whispering about the commotion. Inside, time slowed to a heavy, deliberate crawl. Elijah felt the weight of what could have been pressing into his chest like a lead plate. He turned toward the vent above the counter, and something else caught his attention, the faint shimmer of residue, tiny droplets around the metal rim. He stood on a chair, heart pounding, and when he leaned closer, the smell hit him. Sharp chemical and terrifyingly familiar. The vent, he murmured. It carried it. The officer looked up. "Carried with the cleaner," Elijah said, pointing. "When I ran the fan this morning, it must have pushed the fumes through the kitchen. Duke probably caught it before we even opened the oats." The realization cut through him like a blade. His dog had been fighting against an invisible threat since dawn. That's why he'd paced, why he'd growled, why he'd refused to eat his own breakfast. Elijah dropped back down, feeling his knees give slightly beneath him. He reached for Duke again, brushing a hand through his fur. "You were trying to tell me," he whispered. Duke pressed his nose into Elijah's hand, a small, quiet sound vibrating in his throat. The connection between them, wordless, instinctive, tightened into something sacred. The officer near the table cleared his throat. "We'll take samples, sir. You'll need to dispose of all contaminated food." Elijah nodded faintly, barely hearing. His focus was fixed on the vent, the pantry, the air itself. He could still smell it faintly, like bleach and guilt. Lorene stepped forward, her voice breaking. "Elijah, what if the baby had eaten that? What if he cut her off gently? He didn't, that's what matters." But his voice cracked under the strain. He turned away, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. The guilt sat heavy in his gut. It had been his job to keep this house safe, to keep his son safe. And it wasn't him who'd seen the danger. It was the one creature everyone else had feared for a split second. He glanced at the dog again, remembering all the mornings he'd scolded him for barking at shadows, for growling at nothing. Maybe Duke had never been wrong. Maybe people were just too busy, too human to listen. "Sir," the officer said quietly, "you should probably step outside for a bit, get some air." Elijah shook his head. "No, I'm not leaving my son, not my house." The woman nodded once, understanding. She turned toward her partner, signaling for the rest of the unit to clear out. The hum of voices faded as the house slowly emptied, leaving only Elijah, Lorene, Caleb, and Duke in the stillness that followed chaos. The late morning light filtered through the blinds, streaking across the floor in pale gold. Dust motes floated like tiny ghosts in the air. Elijah looked around at the kitchen, the overturned chair, the spoon on the floor, the small handprint on the tray, and he felt the truth settle deep inside him. They had been seconds away from losing everything. He crouched beside Duke once more, both of them staring at the same bowl that had almost brought an ending to their peace. "You saved him," he said quietly. "You saved all of us." Duke blinked slowly, as if acknowledging the words, then looked toward Caleb, still in Loreen's arms, now fast asleep. The baby's chest rose and fell steadily, each breath a reminder of what loyalty had preserved. Elijah exhaled long and slow, his fear bleeding into relief. He had seen death before in war and hospitals, in the quiet after the funeral, but never had it come this close. Never had it lingered right in front of him disguised as breakfast. And he knew deep in his bones that the only reason he was holding his child now was because one creature refused to ignore what others dismissed. That realization would never leave him. The sirens were gone now, leaving behind only the low hum of engines idling outside and the muffled chatter of neighbors gathering near the porch. The kitchen smelled of bleach and fear, a combination that clung to the walls and refused to fade. Elijah stood by the sink, hands trembling slightly as he washed the residue from his palms. But no matter how many times he scrubbed, he could still feel the sting of guilt under his skin. The officers had sealed the oatmeal bowl in a clear evidence bag, and it sat now on the counter like a symbol of everything he almost lost. Duke remained seated near the high chair, watchful, his chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm, the golden fur along his neck glinting faintly in the morning light. One of the investigators, a man named Sergeant Hollis, approached with a clipboard. "We've run preliminary field tests," he said. His tone was calm, but heavy, the kind of tone that came from experience with tragedy. Elijah braced himself, and Hollis sighed through his nose. "It's industrial cleaner, high concentration, something that probably came from one of your kitchen products." He paused, flipping through his notes. Judging from the dilution, it wouldn't take much, maybe one small spoonful. Elijah's throat tightened. One spoonful, Hollis nodded grimly. That would have been enough to stop a child's heart within minutes. The words hit like a hammer to the chest. Elijah turned his head slightly, eyes landing on Caleb, who slept peacefully now in Loreen's arms, completely unaware of the horror that had almost touched him. The idea that death had been sitting on his breakfast tray only inches away made Elijah's knees weak. He steadied himself against the counter, gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. Hollis set the clipboard down. "Your dog saved that baby, sir. You understand that?" Elijah nodded numbly. "Yeah," he whispered, voice dry. "I understand." He looked down at Duke, who gazed up at him quietly. No pride, no excitement, just the calm certainty of an animal who'd done his duty and needed no applause. Hollis crouched slightly, watching the dog. "He didn't even touch the food, did he know?" Elijah said. "He barked, lunged everyone, thought he was attacking the nanny, but he was stopping her from feeding my boy." Hollis gave a small nod, impressed. "Good instincts. These canine breeds, they sense things we can't even imagine. Sometimes it's scent, sometimes it's just intuition." His words trailed off as another officer entered the room, holding a clipboard and 2 sealed bags. "We found the leak," she said. "The bottle was cracked at the base, probably dripped into the oats overnight. Looks accidental, but we'll still send it for lab confirmation." Elijah exhaled shakily, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Accidental or not," he muttered, "it almost killed my son." Loreen, standing a few feet away, broke into tears again. "I didn't mean for any of this. I didn't even know." Elijah shook his head, cutting her off gently. "I know, Loreen. I know you didn't." She clutched the baby closer, her sobs quieting into whispers. "He's a good boy, Elijah. Your dog. He's the reason that baby's breathing." Elijah swallowed hard. "Yeah," he said again. "He is. He turned to Hollis. "You said one spoonful could have killed him." How much was in the bowl? Hollis looked uncomfortable. More than one. Elijah felt his legs weaken again, but this time he didn't let himself fall. He just nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the counter where the evidence bag glinted beneath the fluorescent light. "You can take whatever you need," he said softly. "Just tell me when you're done." Hollis placed a hand on his shoulder. "We're just finishing up. You did good calling us when you did." But Elijah didn't feel like he'd done anything good. The only one who had acted in time was the dog, now sitting quietly on the floor, still guarding the space where the bowl had been. The house had gone too still, the kind of silence that felt like the moment after a storm, everything technically safe, but nothing the same. Elijah leaned against the counter, staring out the window. Beyond the police cars, the sky was bright and painfully clear. The world was moving on while his remained frozen in that single image, Duke lunging Lorene, screaming Caleb, crying the spoon falling. Each second of that chaos had been a heartbeat away from disaster. Hollis walked towards the door, murmuring something into his radio. The younger officer followed him, carrying the evidence bags, and for a brief moment, the sunlight caught the sealed bowl, the small black flecks glinting faintly like a cruel reminder. When the door closed, the silence returned fully. Elijah turned, moving slowly to where Duke sat. The dog looked up, ears perking slightly, his gaze steady and calm. Elijah knelt beside him, running a trembling hand through his fur. "You knew," he whispered again. "You knew before any of us." Duke's tail tapped once against the floor, soft but sure. Elijah rested his forehead against the dog's shoulder, eyes closing. "I didn't listen," he murmured. "You were trying to tell me, and I didn't listen." The guilt ran deep. It wasn't just about the poison, it was about trust. He'd lived long enough to know that sometimes salvation comes from places you overlook, voices you dismiss, instincts you silence. He looked up again, studying Duke's face. There was no arrogance there, no awareness of his heroism, just quiet loyalty. "You saved my boy," Elijah whispered. "You saved my world outside." A light breeze stirred the curtains, bringing in the faint smell of rain. The air felt cleaner now, lighter, but the weight in his chest didn't lift. He stood slowly, wiping his face, and turned to Lorene. She sat on the couch in the next room, cradling Caleb. The baby was awake again, reaching for her necklace with chubby fingers. "He's okay," she said softly, almost to herself. Elijah nodded. "Yeah, he's okay." But his voice trembled with the fragility of the truth. One spoonful, 1 second, one small act of instinct, that was all that had stood between life and loss. The officers had taken their samples and left, leaving Elijah in a house that felt quieter than it ever had before. The kind of silence that pressed against the chest until breathing became an effort. The kitchen was spotless now, yet it reeked of something invisible, the echo of fear and the bitter sting of realization. Duke lay near the back door, his ears alert, watching Elijah's every move with eyes that said more than words ever could. Lorene had taken Caleb upstairs to nap, her voice still trembling as she whispered a lullaby, trying to soothe herself as much as the baby. Elijah stood by the pantry with the cracked bottle in his hand, the plastic cool and light, almost innocent, and yet inside it rested the very thing that had nearly killed his son. He turned it slowly, staring at the fracture near the cap, a tiny hairline split almost unnoticeable unless the light caught it just right. The label was peeling, stained from years of use. He'd used that same bottle the night before, wiping down the counters, never thinking twice. His stomach twisted as he realized that the cleaner had probably dripped down the shelf and into the open oatmeal container he'd forgotten to close. His fault, his negligence, his son's near death. He felt a weight settle over him like chains. Duke let out a low breath as if he could sense the guilt spilling through the room. Elijah sat down on the floor beside him, the bottle resting between them. "It was me," he said quietly, his voice almost too soft to hear. "I did this. I didn't mean to, but I did." Duke lifted his head eyes, steady tail, giving one slow thump against the floor. He didn't judge, didn't condemn, just existed with Elijah in that space where love and failure collided. Elijah rubbed his temples, exhaustion settling deep in his bones. "You stopped me from losing him," he whispered. "You stopped me from losing everything." The memory replayed again, sharper this time. Duke lunging the bark, the scream, the spoon flying. It had looked like chaos then, but now Elijah saw the pattern. Duke had gone straight for the spoon, not Laureen. Straight for the danger. Instinct had filled the gaps where reason failed. Elijah stood up slowly and opened the window wider, letting the humid Carolina air flow through. Outside, the sound of cicadas droned faintly, a strange comfort in the aftermath of crisis. The world hadn't stopped, even though his had nearly collapsed. He took the cleaner bottle outside, walking toward the garbage bins near the fence. Each step felt heavy. He dropped it into the bin and stood there for a moment, staring at it. It looked so small down there, so meaningless, and yet its contents had held the power to destroy an entire life in seconds. He whispered under his breath, "Never again." Duke followed him outside, stretching in the sunlight, tail brushing against Elijah's leg. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, clean safe. Elijah crouched down, rubbing the dog's neck. "You trusted your instincts," he said. "I ignored mine." The admission hurt, but it was true. He dismissed the small signs, the pacing, the way Duke had hovered by the pantry, the subtle shift in his behavior. He'd been too focused on keeping routine, too desperate for normalcy to listen to the creature that saw what he couldn't. Duke leaned closer, resting his chin on Elijah's knee. His warmth grounded him, pulling him back from the pit of guilt. "You knew before I did," Elijah murmured. "Maybe that's what love really is, seeing danger before someone else does and standing in the way." The words came out heavy, but cleansing, as if saying them out loud somehow released the poison that had seeped not just into the food, but into Elijah's heart. He realized that Duke's bark wasn't just instinct, it was devotion, the raw kind that defies logic. A loyalty that stands between life and death without hesitation. The afternoon sun had shifted higher now, casting long shadows across the yard. Elijah could still hear faint murmurs from the neighbors over the fence, their voices soft with pity and admiration. "That dog saved the baby," someone whispered. "Never seen anything like it." Elijah exhaled deeply and went back inside, closing the door behind him. The kitchen felt emptier, without the police gear and evidence bags, but it also felt lighter, like the house itself was breathing again. He cleaned the counters again, even though they didn't need it. Each wipe a silent confession of carelessness turned repentance. When he finished, he filled Duke's water bowl and set it down. The German Shepherd lapped it up slowly, tail flicking once in satisfaction before settling down. Elijah leaned against the counter, staring at the ceiling. "You fixed what I broke," he said quietly. "You saved him from me." He didn't mean it literally. He knew he hadn't poisoned his child intentionally, but the words still felt like the truth. Duke lifted his head at the sound of his voice, then stood and padded toward the hallway where Caleb slept. He paused by the stairs, looking back once, and Elijah followed. Upstairs, the soft rhythm of Laureen's lullaby carried through the cracked nursery door. Duke pushed it open gently with his paw and entered, sitting down beside the crib. Elijah stood in the doorway watching. The baby's stirred eyes fluttering for a second, then fell back asleep. Duke rested his head on the floor, eyes half closed, content but alert. Elijah's heart clenched at the sight that dog guarding his son like a knight sworn to protect royalty. He knelt beside the crib, resting one hand on Duke's back. "I owe you everything," he whispered. The dog didn't move, but the slow rise and fall of his chest was enough. The house was still again, but it wasn't an empty stillness. This time, it was peace rebuilt on the edge of fear, fragile but real. Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, letting the gratitude wash through him. He thought about the past few hours, the screaming, The barking, the sirens, the silence that followed, and realized how fast life could turn. The afternoon light faded softly through the blinds, painting long golden stripes across the kitchen floor, where Duke now rested. The air was quiet except for the steady hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of wood under Elijah's boots. Upstairs, Caleb slept peacefully, unaware that his father stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty space where a bowl of poisoned oatmeal once sat. Lorene sat at the table, her hands clasped together, tightly, fingers trembling as she stared down at the wood grain. Her eyes were red, her voice almost gone. "I keep seeing it over and over," she whispered. "The way he barked, the way he lunged. I thought he was going to hurt me." Elijah didn't answer. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed his face, carved with exhaustion. The guilt had settled into his bones, cold and heavy, and no matter how many times he reminded himself that it was an accident, it still felt like sin. Duke's tail flicked once on the floor, but he didn't move. He was watching both of them, his body still tense, his loyalty still in overdrive. Lorene finally spoke again, her voice cracking. "I almost yelled at him this morning," she said softly. Elijah lifted his head, surprised. "What?" She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Before you came into the kitchen, he kept pacing by the pantry door. I was trying to get the baby's food ready, and he wouldn't stop walking back and forth. I thought he was looking for scraps or being restless, so I almost shouted at him to get out. I even clapped my hands to scare him off, but he just looked at me, like he was begging me to understand." She pressed her hands to her face and sobbed quietly. "He was trying to tell me, and I didn't listen." Elijah closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. The truth cut through the last bit of denial left inside him. Duke had known from the start. The pacing hadn't been nervousness, it had been a warning. The signs had been there right in front of them, and they'd all ignored them because they were too human, too trusting of the ordinary. He pushed himself off the counter and walked slowly toward Lorene, pulling out the chair across from her. "You didn't know," he said quietly. "Neither of us did." She shook her head, her voice breaking. "I feel so stupid, Elijah. I thought I was helping. I almost killed him." "No," Elijah said firmly. "You didn't. You saved him when you called out. You stopped when you saw the dog. That's what saved him." But his own words barely registered in his mind because he could still see it, all the black specks in the bowl, the way Duke had placed himself between the child and the spoon, the urgency in his bark that it sounded more like a plea than a threat. Lorene wiped her eyes and managed a small, trembling laugh. "He's not just a dog," she whispered. "He's like, I don't know, something else." Elijah followed her gaze to Duke, who lay calmly on the floor, now his eyes half closed but alert, his breathing steady. "He's family," Elijah said. "That's what he is." Lorene nodded slowly, her expression softening. "He knew before any of us did." Elijah leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "He always does," he said. "Every storm, every stranger, every bad day. He just knows." The words lingered in the air, heavy and true. The sunlight dimmed further, the edges of the room fading into shadows. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance, low and far away. The coming rain felt fitting, like the sky itself was preparing to wash the morning away. Lorene stood and crossed to the window, looking out at the gathering clouds. "You ever think about how close we came?" she asked quietly. Elijah nodded. "Every second since it happened." She turned back to him, her expression softer now. "I think maybe God sent that dog to you," she said. Elijah didn't laugh, didn't even smile. He just looked at Duke again, his heart tightening. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I think so too." There was a long silence between them, filled with everything that didn't need to be said. The guilt, the fear, the gratitude. Finally, Elijah stood and walked to the sink, pouring himself a glass of water. The movement felt automatic, almost mechanical, but it helped to keep him grounded. Lorene sat back down, her voice a whisper. When I saw him lunging, I thought I was going to die. I thought he'd gone wild. But when I looked closer, I saw his eyes. They weren't angry. They were terrified. Elijah nodded, his voice quiet but steady. He wasn't fighting you, Lorene. He was fighting fate. The words came out heavier than he expected. Duke's ears twitched at the sound of his name, and Elijah looked down at him again. The dog met his gaze, and for a moment, man and animal shared something deeper than language, something built from trust, trial, and redemption. Elijah crouched beside him, pressing his hand to Duke's head. "You did what I couldn't," he whispered. "You saw it coming. You stood your ground." Duke nudged his hand gently, then rested his muzzle on his knee. The simplicity of that gesture broke something loose in Elijah's chest, and his eyes stung. He had fought wars, buried friends, and stood strong through loss. But this was the first time in years he felt tears fall without shame. He didn't wipe them away. Lorene turned toward him, her voice soft. "You okay?" Elijah nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "For the first time today, I think I am." She smiled faintly, her own tears still glistening. "He's a hero," she said, looking at Duke. "Not the kind you read about, but the kind that saves lives when no one's watching." Elijah glanced down at his dog, again voice low and raw. "He doesn't need anyone to write about him," he said. "He just needs us to remember." Outside, the first raindrops began to fall, tapping gently against the window. The sound filled the silence with rhythm, soft and forgiving. Lorene stood and placed a gentle hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You should rest," she said quietly. "You've been running on fear all day." He nodded, but didn't move. His eyes stayed on Duke, who had closed his eyes again, but kept his ears turned towards the stairs, still guarding, still listening. The storm clouds that had gathered throughout the afternoon finally broke open, just as dusk began to settle over the Carolina horizon, filling the world outside Elijah's window with the rhythmic sound of cleansing rain. Inside, the air had changed. It was no longer filled with the sharp scent of chemicals or panic. Now, it carried the warmth of wet earth and quiet redemption. The police had gone, the neighbors had drifted back to their own lives, and the house stood still once more. The walls held the memory of what almost happened, but there was peace now, a fragile, trembling kind of peace that only comes after surviving something you weren't sure you would. Elijah stood at the kitchen sink, staring out through the rain-smeared glass, his reflection overlapping with the faint shimmer of lightning outside. His face looked older, not from age, but from realization. The events of the morning had carved something permanent into him, something he could never forget. He could still hear Duke's bark, still see the panic in Lorene's eyes, still smell that poisonous tang mixed with oatmeal and fear. He would never forget how close he had come to losing everything, and how the hand of salvation had come not from a person, but from a creature of instinct and devotion. Behind him, Duke lay stretched across the floor near the doorway, his fur still damp from the quick walk Elijah had taken him on earlier. He was half asleep, chest rising and falling slowly, but his ears flicked at every sound, ever vigilant, ever ready. Upstairs, Caleb slept quietly, his tiny breath steady and deep. Lorene had retreated to the guest room, exhausted beyond words. The whole house seemed to breathe differently now, as if everyone inside it had been remade by the day. Elijah turned away from the window and crouched beside Duke, the motion slow, reverent. He placed one hand on the dog's head, his fingers threading through the thick fur, and whispered, "You saved my boy." His voice trembled, breaking on the last word. Duke opened his eyes and looked up, his gaze calm and unwavering. Elijah could feel the tears burning behind his eyelids, but this time he didn't fight them. He let them fall, his hand trembling slightly as he rested it on Duke's neck. "I didn't listen," he said quietly. "You tried to tell me, and I didn't listen." Duke shifted slightly, licking Elijah's wrist. The same wrist that had once yanked his collar in panic, the same hand that had pulled him back when he lunged toward the nanny. The gesture broke Elijah completely. He bowed his head, his shoulders shaking, and for the first time in years, he cried openly, not from grief or fear, but from overwhelming gratitude. "I don't deserve you," he whispered, "not after everything." The rain outside deepened, drumming harder against the glass. Duke nudged his head under Elijah's hand, urging him to keep petting, to keep breathing. In that silent exchange, Elijah felt something sacred, an understanding that went beyond words. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, it was recognition. The kind that happens when love meets failure and still chooses to stay. He stood slowly wiping his face with his sleeve. The storm outside flashed with lightning, and for a moment the kitchen filled with white light. Duke's eyes reflected it, shining like two amber lanterns. Elijah turned off the lights and sat down on the floor beside him, back against the wall, knees drawn up. The room was dim now, only the lightning flickering across it, the thunder rolling like a heartbeat. "You didn't just save him," Elijah said softly. "You saved me too." Duke laid his head on Elijah's knee-tail, tapping once before settling again. The sound of Caleb's soft cooing drifted faintly from upstairs, a reminder of the life that had been spared. Elijah smiled weakly through the tears. "He'll grow up knowing what you did," he murmured. "He'll know who you are." The thought comforted him. The idea that his son would grow up remembering not the fear of this day, but the love that conquered it. He closed his eyes, listening to the rain, each drop, a note in the symphony of forgiveness. Hours passed quietly like that. The rain slowed, the thunder softened, and the night deepened. Elijah eventually stood his knees stiff and walked to check on Caleb. The nursery glowed softly from the nightlight, painting gentle halos across the crib. Caleb's tiny chest rose and fell. His lips parted in sleep, his little hand resting near his face. Elijah leaned over the crib, brushing a curl of dark hair from his son's forehead. "You don't know how close I came to losing you," he whispered, "and you don't know who saved you." He looked down at Duke, who had followed him upstairs, and now lay at the foot of the crib paws, crossed eyes wide open. "But you will," Elijah added. "One day you will." The moment stretched in stillness, broken only by the sound of rain easing into mist outside. The clock on the wall ticked softly, steady and calm. For the first time that day, Elijah didn't feel fear tighten his chest. He felt purpose. He walked back downstairs, turning off the remaining lights, letting the soft orange glow from the street lamps filter through the windows. He sat again beside Duke on the couch, the house finally quiet around them. "I spent years thinking strength meant control," Elijah said softly. "But maybe strength is trust. Maybe it's knowing when to listen, even when you don't understand." Duke's ear twitched and Elijah smiled faintly. "You taught me that today." The rain had nearly stopped, now the steady tapping reduced to a gentle drip from the roof. The scent of the storm drifted through the open window, clean, earthy, pure. Elijah leaned back, feeling exhaustion settle into his bones, but it wasn't the heavy exhaustion of despair. It was release. He looked at Duke again, reaching down to scratch gently behind his ear. "You fixed what I broke," he said quietly. "You gave me another chance." The storm had ended sometime after midnight, leaving behind a heavy calm that settled over the house like a blanket of absolution. The moonlight pushed through the thinning clouds, spilling soft silver across the yard, glinting off puddles and wet leaves. Inside, the faint sound of dripping water from the eaves was the only rhythm, steady and reassuring. Elijah sat in the nursery again, too restless to sleep, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the crib. Caleb slept soundly, his small chest rising and falling in even rhythm. One hand curled around the worn edge of his blanket. The soft hum of the nightlight painted the room in amber hues, a kind of fragile magic that made everything seem safe again. Duke lay at the foot of the crib, stretched out but alert, his head resting between his paws, his amber eyes half closed, but never fully asleep. Elijah could see the rise and fall of his chest, could hear the faint sighs that came every few breaths, and the steady comfort of that sound steadied him in return. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, this same room had felt like the edge of a cliff. He remembered holding his son tight while the sirens blared, the trembling in his hands, the hollowness in his gut, the thought that he might not get another day. But now there was peace. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it filled him with a quiet kind of gratitude he hadn't felt since before his wife passed. He leaned back in the rocking chair, the old wood creaking softly beneath his weight, and whispered a prayer under his breath, his voice low and rough from exhaustion. "Thank you, Lord," he murmured, staring at his sleeping child, "for letting me keep him, for letting me see this night." His throat tightened as he tried to continue. "And thank you for sending me the one who saw what I didn't." His eyes flicked toward Duke, who stirred slightly at the sound of his name, but didn't lift his head. Elijah smiled faintly. "You're not just a dog," he whispered. "You're an answer." The words hung in the air, quiet but certain like truth, revealed not through thunder or miracles, but through loyalty and instinct. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, scattering droplets from the leaves. The moon slipped behind a cloud, dimming the room for a few seconds before returning with soft light that glowed across Duke's fur. Elijah tilted his head back against the chair, closing his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, he saw something that made his breath catch. Caleb had stirred in his sleep, shifting just enough for his small hand to slip between the crib rails and find Duke's ear. His fingers curled around it, holding tight. Duke didn't flinch. He didn't even open his eyes. He simply let it happen, his body still, his breathing unchanged, as if he'd been waiting for that exact touch. Elijah felt something swell in his chest, that no words could contain: love, relief, awe, all at once. The bond between them was something pure, something he hadn't realized existed until this moment. A protector, and the one he protected bound by something older than language, older than fear. He stood slowly moving closer, careful not to wake either of them. He rested a hand on the edge of the crib and whispered, "He's got you, son. You're safe." His voice broke slightly at the end. He sank to one knee beside Duke and brushed his fingers across the dog's back, feeling the warmth beneath the fur. "You don't even know how much you've done," he said softly. "You'll never understand it the way I do." Duke's tail moved, once barely a flicker, but it was enough. The gesture said everything no thanks needed, no recognition required. This was his purpose, his place. Elijah stayed there for a while, kneeling beside his son and his dog, the two beings he loved most in the world, feeling the quiet rhythm of their breathing merge with his own. The house around them was still save for the faint ticking of the hallway clock and the distant drip of rain from the gutters. For the first time since the accident that had taken his wife, Elijah felt something he hadn't dared to feel: completeness. Not in the sense that the loss was gone, but that something broken inside him had been mended by grace. He whispered another prayer, his head bowed. "Forgive me for not seeing sooner, for not hearing what was right in front of me. I promise, Lord, I'll do better. I'll listen next time. I'll pay attention to what love looks like, even when it doesn't look like what I expect." His voice faded into the hush of the room. He sat back down in the chair, his body finally relaxing, exhaustion tugging at his eyelids. The rain had stopped completely now, and through the window he could see the faint glow of the moon reflected in the puddles outside. Duke remained at his post, eyes half-lidded, but alert, every part of him attuned to the small life breathing softly above. Caleb murmured again in his sleep, his tiny fingers tightening briefly around Duke's ear, and the dog didn't move an inch. Elijah smiled through tears that shimmered in the soft glow of the nightlight. "You're staying till morning, aren't you, boy?" he whispered. Duke didn't answer, but he didn't need to. His stillness said everything. The night stretched long and peaceful, the kind of quiet that feels earned. Elijah leaned his head back again, closing his eyes, letting the rhythmic sounds of breathing, ticking, and the occasional creak of wood soothe him toward rest. Before sleep took him, he whispered one final thought, soft and reverent. "You were my miracle today." And when the first hint of dawn finally crept into the room hours later, painting the walls in pale gold, Duke was still there, unmoved, unflinching, faithful to the end. When morning came, the sky was washed in gold, soft and clean, the kind of light that makes the world look forgiven. Dew sparkled on the grass, steam rose from the damp road, and the air smelled of earth and renewal. Elijah stood on the porch with a mug of coffee, his eyes tired but clear, watching Duke stretch in the yard. The German shepherd sniffed the breeze tail swaying gently, his fur catching the sunlight like a halo. Inside, Caleb babbled softly in his crib, a tune of innocence that made Elijah's heart ache in the best way. He still couldn't believe they had survived yesterday. It felt like something that should have left scars, and maybe it had just not the kind that showed on skin. Lorene joined him at the door, her face pale but peaceful. "He didn't leave that crib once last night," she said, voice thick with awe. Elijah nodded his gaze, following Duke's steady gait as he circled the yard, once still alert, still listening to things humans couldn't hear. "No," Elijah said quietly, "he doesn't leave what he loves." Lorene looked at him for a long moment before stepping outside and walking toward Duke. She knelt down, ran a hand through his fur, and whispered something Elijah couldn't hear. When she returned, she was crying, but smiling. "He knows," she said softly. Elijah didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. Word travels fast in small towns, and by noon, the neighbors began to arrive, some with casseroles, some with coffee, all with the same wide-eyed gratitude. They had heard the story, how a dog had saved a baby, how instinct had triumphed where reason failed. Reporters came from the local paper, taking pictures of Duke on the porch beside Caleb, who reached for his ear with a laugh. The headline the next day read, "Dog's Bark Saves Infant in Ridgefield Miracle." Elijah didn't like the word miracle at first, but later, when he thought about how the day had unfolded, he realized it fit. The truth wasn't in the noise of the story. It was in the quiet that followed. Days turned to weeks, and life found rhythm again. The house no longer smelled of cleaner, only of warmth, of cooking, of home. Duke's bowl sat by the back door, polished and full each morning. Every evening, Elijah would sit beside him on the porch as the sun went down, their silence filled with unspoken understanding. Caleb would crawl to Duke's paws, tugging his fur, laughing that big belly laugh that only babies have. And Duke would let him patient and proud, as if he knew the child he'd saved was part of his purpose. The town wanted to give Duke a medal, but Elijah refused. "He doesn't need ceremony," he told them. "He just needs us to remember." Still, one morning, the town carpenter came by with a small gift, a wooden plaque attached to a leather tag meant for Duke's collar. Burned into the wood in careful letters were the words, "Protector of Grace." The name had come from a neighbor who said Duke's bark was grace in sound. Elijah fastened it gently to the collar, his hands trembling slightly as he did. When he was finished, he whispered, "You earned this, old boy." Duke turned his head slightly, tail brushing against Elijah's knee, as if embarrassed by the attention. The plaque caught the sunlight, glowing faintly against his golden fur. Later that night, when the house was quiet and the world outside hummed with crickets, Elijah took out his carving knife. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where fear had once lived, and pressed the blade into the wood beneath the engraved title. The words came easily, honest and simple. He didn't bark for praise, he barked for love. When he was done, he set the tag down and ran his fingers across the grooves, feeling the truth in them. He knew one day Duke would grow old, his muzzle would turn gray, and his bark would lose its power, but this message would stay carved deeper than the years could reach. The following Sunday, the local church pastor asked Elijah to speak briefly during service. The congregation was small, just farmer shop owners and families who'd known him since before Caleb was born. Elijah stood before them, holding his son in his arms, and spoke from a heart that had been broken and remade in the span of one morning. Sometimes, he said, his voice soft, but clear love doesn't look like what we expect. It doesn't always come with words or reason. Sometimes it growls, sometimes it barks, sometimes it bites, if that's what it takes to protect you. And if you're too busy, too proud, or too distracted, you might mistake it for trouble when it's really the only thing standing between you and tragedy. His voice faltered for a moment as he looked down at Caleb, who reached for his father's chin and giggled. Elijah smiled faintly and continued. I used to think God showed up in miracles that looked big, things you could see and name and thank Him for. But now I think maybe He shows up quieter, in loyalty, in instinct, in the way something created by His hands can feel what we don't. Maybe grace doesn't always roar, sometimes it just barks. When he finished, the congregation was silent for a moment before soft murmurs of amen filled the air. Afterward, people came up to him one by one, some with tears, some with trembling smiles, all touched by the truth of what they'd heard. When Elijah returned home that afternoon, Duke met him at the porch steps, sitting tall, his new tag glinting faintly in the sun. Elijah crouched beside him, placed a hand on his head, and whispered, "You started all this, didn't you? You reminded them what love looks like." Duke pressed his muzzle into Elijah's palm, eyes warm and steady. Caleb, toddling nearby, laughed and clapped, reaching toward the dog. Elijah lifted his son and set him gently on Duke's back, just for a moment, and the boy squealed with delight while the old shepherd stood perfectly still, patient as always. For Elijah, it was the most beautiful sight he'd ever seen. A picture of redemption, faith, and unconditional love, framed by the same porch where his world had nearly shattered. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet, Elijah whispered to himself, "You barked for love, didn't you, boy? That's all you ever did." Duke turned his head at the soundtail, giving one small wag before he settled down again, his watchful gaze drifting toward the horizon. The day faded into evening, and Elijah sat there with Caleb on his lap, Duke at his feet, and peace finally inside his heart. The lesson wasn't complicated, but it was eternal that love, in its truest form, protects without pride, forgives without demand, and acts before understanding catches up. And sometimes the ones who teach it best aren't human at all. The end. If this story moved, you don't forget to like and subscribe for more real stories of loyalty and grace. Tell us what part of Duke's story touched your heart most, and let us know where you're watching from. In the comments, we'd love to hear your thoughts.